The story of Lewis and Clark. Way back when the United States was only 1/3 of the size it was today, most of America was unknown and uncharted. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, made the controversial decision to buy the Louisiana Territory from the French Emperor Napoleon and nearly doubled its size. The only problem was that Louisiana was completely unmapped and unexplored. Luckily for Jefferson, the perfect man to do just that job was working for him as his personal secretary. Meriwether Lewis was a frontiersman and an ex-soldier. He was a skilled mapmaker and very comfortable with surviving in the wilderness. He asked his old army friend William Clark, a man of similar skills, to help him out on the journey as his co-captain. The two set out on May 12, 1804, with a crew of 32 men called the Corps of Discovery. Their mission was to find a source of water that led to the Pacific, explore and map the unknown territory, and establish trade and good relationships with the Native Americans along the way. Lewis required all who were able to read and write to keep a detailed journal of the expedition to document the entire trip perfectly. The corps left from St. Louis up the Missouri River, and the heroic journey began with relative ease, but later on it was anything but smooth sailing. There were many obstacles that the corps had to face while exploring. The river had lots of threats that made it hard to navigate. Trees along the river were some of the biggest problem causers. Fallen branches and trunks would constantly hit the bottom of the boats and force the crew to stop and deal with the problem. They called the fallen branches snags because they would snag the boat and stop it from moving completely. One time the mast of the boat collided with a low-hanging branch and the corps couldn't travel for days until they fixed it. Sandbanks were also very hazardous to the expedition. The boats would get stuck in them and the crew would have to push their way out. And sometimes, huge chunks of dirt along the edge of the river would fall off and almost hit the boat. For Lewis, the journey was almost ended 9 days after it began. He was climbing a cliff, exploring, and trying to get a better view of the road ahead of them, when he lost his footing and almost fell to his death. It would have been a short journey for Lewis if he hadn't stuck his knife into the cliff at the last second. 6 months into the expedition, the crew finally met one of the most influential people to the expedition. The corps eventually found themselves in Mandan Indian Territory. There they met Sacagawea. Winter was coming fast, so the corps decided to build a fort near the Mandans and make camp for the winter. Their relationship with the Mandans only grew stronger during the winter months. They helped each other out, and the corps even named their camp Fort Mandan after them in their honor. Once the winter was over, the Mandans gave Lewis and Clark Sacagawea as a guide to help them out for the rest of their journey. Farther and farther, Lewis and Clark sailed down the Missouri River until they couldn't go anymore. They reached the Rocky Mountains and didn't have a clear and easy enough path to sail on anymore, and they knew they had to continue on land. So they went to the Indians again, since they had helped them out countless times before on their journey. The closest tribe to them was the Shoshone, and at first they were hesitant to help the crew cross the Rockies. But then the chief of the tribe realized that Sacagawea was his long-lost sister. She had been captured and sold to the Mandan years before Jefferson was even president. The family connection helped the travelers trade the Indians for horses, and they went off to cross the mountains. After a long and dangerous trek by land, the crew stumbled upon the Columbia River. Once again, winter was approaching fast, and the crew had no idea how much farther they were from the coast. They didn't even know if the Columbia would take them there. But they pressed on down the river, exploring and mapping everything they could. Just in the nick of time, they reached the ocean. It was November 7th, so there was no time for celebration. The corps had to set up camp for the winter again. Remarkably, they built Fort Clatsop in just under 30 days, and it lasted them the whole winter. Once the weather permitted, they left the fort and headed back towards home, their journey over. Lewis and Clark hardly ever took a day off. They kept detailed notes of pretty much everything they saw. They didn't only sail down the rivers, they would explore the land that they were passing by too. Lewis and Clark made more than 140 detailed maps of the area they covered. They discovered more than 100 new animals and over 178 new plants. They didn't just map America, they discovered everything about it along the way. The expedition lasted 2 years. They achieved all 3 of the main goals of their expedition, and were treated as heroes when they returned back to civilization.